Today we'll be discussing how social data predicted Trump's win when traditional polling failed. In this webinar, we will investigate how signals in social data were better predictors of the Trump win than traditional polling. First, we'll spend just a little bit of time explaining our methodology, what the predictive metrics were, and some key takeaways. For those who always rely on research and polling to let us know what is going on, the question was, how could the polls have gotten it so overwhelmingly wrong? This is not the first time that tracking polls have come up with errors or have been wrong, but it was the degree of error that was surprising. Since the predictions leading to the election showed a strong degree of confidence that Clinton was going to win, there's been a lot of questions on how the polls could have missed it to such a scale. And the questions about the polls are coming from all different sources and different places. There are a number of answers. Was it the turnout? Something to do with the Electoral College? Or was it because of Trump's supporters? No one has been asking what we're going to do differently next time. Polling in elections is incredibly important because it drives behavior and can have a big impact on voter turnout. People can lose the motivation to vote if they feel that the result is a foregone conclusion. So getting these polls correct is important. And if the traditional methods are failing us, what are we going to do? This is the question that we asked within our team, and we came up with some pretty compelling answers, and we're excited to share them with you today. So one of the reasons that we're so confident doing this in social data is because there are some strong advantages that we've already found in other studies about social data over traditional methodologies. And it comes to these three buckets. First of all, given the real-time nature that social data gives, it allows us to get to a place to understand not only what happened, but also why. Social delivers honest, organic, and open opinion, not likely to be skewed by the needs some people need to provide the right answer when interviewed. And finally, in terms of engagement, polls give no indication of whether people will actually turn out on voting day. With social engagement and the fact that people are voluntarily going online and discussing their opinions and feelings, there's a real potential to be a strong predictor of voter turnout. So why are we here talking about this today? While we are a social intelligence business and we have social intelligence tools, we are not typical social listeners. Our team of researchers comes from a professional research background, and we immerse ourselves in tools that we have built for the purpose of conducting research using social data as a set. They've been built specifically with market research applications in mind. Now, onto the findings. That's why we set up searches to collect data for each of the candidates during the last 3 months before Election Day. It turns out there was massive engagement in the presidential race, and we ended up with over 25 million social conversations. So with such a large amount of data, it was crucial to look for first indicators of emerging patterns. We took an approach where we went from the outer layers of what can be observed to the inner layers of what was driving these observable patterns. First, we wanted to see what the data shows and then what the data tells us. So to start with, we looked at the volume and sentiment for the main candidates, for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And here you can see an aggregate of sentiment during the entire tracking period. So you might wonder why the sentiment was so similar. We looked into both data sets, and people expressed positive sentiment for their preferred candidate, but they also expressed equally negative sentiment for their opponent. So what now, since sentiment does not show a difference between candidates? When we looked at the daily volume, we see that there was consistently higher engagement for Trump. He also inspired more social conversation and responses to the debates. And then towards the end of the election cycle, shortly before Election Day, when the FBI reopened Clinton's email case, then you can see he pulled away again. So it was pretty close before that when it comes to daily volume, but then the reopening of the email case increases engagement in Trump's data set, made it much more difficult for Hillary Clinton to catch up. Additionally, conversation volume reflects the passion levels of how engaged somebody is and how they might want to actively go online and comment. So for example, a passionate voter will more frequently discuss a candidate or the opponent online than a disengaged voter. Next, we wanted to look more deeply at these observable patterns. Social can reveal the levels of enthusiasm and motivation a person has to convince others to go out and vote. One of the main drivers of motivation is emotions. So we wanted to have a closer look at the role of emotions when it comes to voting in the US. And there are a few very important aspects because voting in America is different than in many other democratic countries. So first of all, it's not the popular vote that wins. Consider the Electoral College. The vote also takes place on a weekday when many Americans have to go to work and not on a weekend. Most elections, it's hard to even get a 50% turnout. And so therein lies the question, who had the most motivated, most inspired voters show up to vote? We hypothesized that the intensity of emotion predicts voter turnout. And with intensity of emotion, we not only refer to the level of enthusiasm for a candidate, but also the level of aversion or passion against the opponent. So you might wonder, how could we capture level of enthusiasm or aversion when sentiment towards candidates was so similar? We have analytics tools that can help us translate the compiled social data into a single score. The score measures the strength of the commitment the person has towards a candidate, and the commitment score can show us then who has the more enthusiastic voters. We plotted the weekly commitment scores that we gained from our methodology and compared them with the weekly average poll scores. And you can see there's quite a reverse effect. So in contrast to the polls results that showed a consistent advantage for Clinton, the commitment score showed a consistent advantage for Trump. Next, we aggregated the commitment scores for the entire tracking period. And to also add context, we also aggregated the commitment scores for Johnson and Stein. We then applied the scores in our commitment framework so that we can better compare these candidates with each other. And the framework is a combination of share of volume and the commitment scores. Clinton had the lowest commitment score, as you can see here, and Johnson had the highest, although he had a lower share of volume. This means that Johnson had strong but few followers. And you can see here that Trump had a little below the average commitment score, but he had the most engaged voters. As a next step, we wanted to look into details of what actually drove these results. And in order to do this, we have the Journey Analytics tool. I'm not going to bore you with all the details here, but it's basically a concept of finding a needle in a haystack. The Journey Analytics tool refines and structures a massive amount of data by identifying conversations along the voter journey. Once the data is structured, we can quantify it and we can then visualize the data. Here are the voter journey stages. These 8 different stages along the voter journey are core emotional stages that drive people to commit to a candidate. The highlighted stages here are affinity, influence, and evangelism, and these have the strongest correlations with how inspired people either argue or fight for a candidate or to fight against the opponent. We would expect differences between the main candidates in these 3 stages where emotions are expressed the most. When we plotted that aggregated journey stage score, then indeed they do differ in these last stages and show the strongest variance in affinity and evangelism. Does Trump also have an advantage in these stages when it comes to conversation volume? Yes, the ratio between Trump and Clinton conversation is highest in the final 3 stages, especially in affinity and evangelism. So let's have a look into one of these stages and the actual conversation that land into these stages. Here you can see the results for the affinity stage. Affinity conversations are conversations where a person communicates positivity towards a candidate and dislike towards the opponent. You see that Trump's affinity scores over time are consistently higher than Clinton's. The gap between affinity score is biggest in the week ending in November 6th. Affinity conversation in this week focused on the FBI investigation of Clinton's emails. It caused a loss of positive stories for Clinton, while Trump supporters increased their stories that Clinton is corrupt and dishonest. Next, let's take a closer look at the influencer stage. Influence measures the degree in which voters' opinions of candidates influences the opinions of others. And for the most part, Trump's influence scores were leading. But Clinton's performance on the first debate had a strong positive impact on her influencer score. But as you can see here, this impact was short-lived because a few weeks later, Trump pulled away again. Let's have a closer look at the evangelism stage. Evangelism conversations are conversations in which a person actively tries to persuade others. So either by promoting his or her preferred candidate or by slandering the competitor. We found a similar pattern here as we found in the affinity stage. Trump has consistently higher evangelism scores over time, and Clinton's performance in the first debate has no impact on her evangelism score, as people seemed already firmly set in their opinions.
What are these patterns that emerge trying to tell us, and what drives them? We analysed conversation in more depth to see if these patterns indicated a difference in emotional intensity between the candidates. When we looked at the differences in emotional intensity within the mentions, we found that Trump inspired stronger and more intense emotions. You see that 39% of conversations among Trump supporters were highly charged. For example, here a voter says, "I will crawl across broken glass to cast my vote for Trump." Factor that info, your useless polls. We also looked at hashtags as a way that people might want to express emotions. And we found that Trump supporters were far more likely to leverage hashtags as a tool to convey the intensity of emotions. So for example, while both Trump's and Clinton's supporters used hashtags in the majority of posts, Trump supporters often included more than 3 hashtags in a single post. I want to mention one hashtag in particular. It's hashtag MAGA. It stands for Make America Great Again, and bring along 3 others to go out to vote. That's a great example of how Trump supporters were more enthusiastic to vote and exhort others to do so. After we looked at the emotional intensity of the conversation, we wanted to look deeper into hidden drivers that might not even be conscious to us. For example, some of those drivers can be bias that we carry and we are not even aware of. There are many inherited biases present in our society, but one of the most prevalent ones is regarding gender. For example, most people would say that women, on average, are more ethical than men. It's part of our stereotyping. Both men and women hold women to a higher ethical standard. And what happens then if a man or woman violated an ethical standard? Well, then women are judged more harshly for a violation and receive harsher punishment for the same ethical violation. I mention this particular research finding here because it fits to the dynamic of this election. We had a woman and a man competing with each other, and both of these candidates faced numerous allegations and were involved in many scandals. So we wanted to see if people actually reacted differently to the scandals. We picked the 4 most prominent scandals for Trump and Clinton. Then we looked at reactions that people had to these scandals, and what we can see here is that across all the Trump scandals, 56% of reactions were negative, with the highest negativity surrounding his undisclosed tax returns. What happened was actually that Trump supporters often defended him and attacked Clinton's scandals instead. And also Trump's scandals were brushed off by saying, "Oh, we don't know, this might just be speculation." In comparison, 75% of Clinton's scandals were negative. That's almost 20% more. Her supporters didn't defend her as much as Trump supporters defended Trump. Here we have some of the examples of the harsh judgments that Clinton received. One person says, "I will vote Trump and encourage my friends to do the same, just to thwart criminal Hillary from being president." This is a good example because, first of all, it shows how that email case was a big obstacle for Hillary Clinton, but it also shows how Trump supporters were enthusiastic, supporting their family and friends to go out to vote. The other thing we wanted to look at was the reactions to the performance of the candidates after the first debate. The media and many people agree that Clinton had a very strong performance, showing competence and composure. When we look at the reactions, though, the biggest difference is that Trump received more positive reactions than Clinton. So instead of focusing on Clinton's performance and content, she was demeaned and judged as a woman. Another thing that we wanted to look at were the words that were used in the data sets. So when we looked at Trump's data set, the word corruption appears numerous times, mostly in context to Clinton. When we looked in comparison to the words that appeared in Clinton's conversations, Trump was the major theme, but not so much a specific scandal or defamation, but more Trump as a person. And even Clinton's supporters often discussed her scandals without really defending them. One more hidden driver that we wanted to investigate is the notion of anti-establishment, the desire for change of the system. We wanted to see what impact this message had on voters. We set up a category with terms related to changing the establishment, and during August and September, the majority of change conversation focused on fighting back against political elitism and corruption. The hashtag #DrainTheSwamp was not introduced until towards the end of the election cycle, but then it was widely shared, which suggests that this message really hit a nerve and strongly resonated within this audience. So in this category of anti-establishment, we checked which candidate was most mentioned. Turned out that Trump was mentioned in 86% of posts, whereas no one mentioned Clinton in the context of change. So Clinton was representing the status quo, and the situation in the US is that people did not want the status quo. So to wrap things up, the US elections were unlike anything we've seen before. So from recording engagement to numerous scandals leading up to the election day, the traditional polls have missed the Trump phenomenon. We wanted to see if social data could predict the outcome, and if we have answers to what drove this historic outcome, and we found that emotional intensity for or against a candidate was key to predicting the outcome. We had several indicators that show the key role of emotional intensity. So our Journey Analytics tool, we found that Trump consistently had higher commitment scores over time. We also identified the size of the advantage for Trump in the latest stages of the voter journey. Then we looked deeper into the hidden drivers of our voter journey results. So Trump was much more effective at harnessing the power of social media, with 3-to-1 advantage over Clinton in the use of hashtags that benefited his campaign. And given the nature of the highest profile Trump scandals, we were very surprised to discover that Clinton's scandals received the more negative reaction, 75% of the time, 20 percentage points higher than Trump's. Lastly, the anti-establishment message was an important theme in this selection, and Trump dominated by capturing 86% of all conversation related to candidates as a change agent.